Okay, let's resume here. Thank you for staying around to the closing panel of this conference. This panel is going to concern cross-cutting issues, which, as you know, are civil enforcement, criminal enforcement, and environmental justice. So if everyone could please take your seats or take your conversations outside, that would be much appreciated. And the moderator for this final session is Alan Knopf of Knopf Shaw in Rochester. Alan is the current chair of the Environmental Law section of the New York State Bar Association. Alan.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon. I just wanted to mention, as chair of the Environmental Law section, Judith Ank had mentioned that she had spoken at our annual meeting and invited us to work on pro bono, and yes, we are working on that project. So if anyone wants to volunteer, please let me know. Also, while I have the soapbox, wanted to mention that we've launched a program to green the New York legal profession, including the court system, and asking more law firms to join the ABA Climate Challenge. So there's details about that on our website. Well, as Mike said, our last panel is going to look at how EPA is enforcing the regulatory requirements that we've been talking about and how they're working to make environmental burdens more equitable. And we have three very distinguished speakers, all from the EPA, on this panel, which we have called cross-cutting issues. Now, if they were from the state, we'd have to call it cost-cutting issues, but this is cross-cutting. So with that, we will first, I will introduce Eric Schaaf, who is the Regional Counsel for EPA Region 2, and he will be speaking on civil enforcement.
This is these two? All right. Thank you, Alan. Couple things. First, a little bit of business. I want to take just a moment to thank Mike Gerard, as well as all the moderators and panelists, and all of you, and everyone who helped to make this conference as excellent a conference as it's turned out to be. So thank you very much, everybody. Michael did the thank yous in the morning, but what that means is he doesn't get thanked. So I just wanted to do that. And the second bit of business that I wanted to do before I get started is to relay to you a comment that Judith made to me as she was leaving. She said, "Did I really say 95 miles per gallon?" She meant 35. She knows that. She's felt terrible about it. But I saw this thoughtful look in her face. 95. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Anyway, I'm also going to ask you to bear with me because Carter at the very end asked a question, which was a very, very thoughtful question, and I thought really got to the crux of a lot of what we need to be thinking about. That's, what do we do? So many problems. How do we prioritize? How do we get at it? What's the guiding principle? That was the term he used. And so in a sense, I've been thinking about that since he asked the question. I was very quiet over there because I was rewriting my presentation. And I'm going to try to do that right now. So I'm going to go through things a little bit differently than I planned to do it. And Alan, I'm going to ask you to keep me on the clock because I have no idea how this is going to go. So I was going to start out with the national results and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to blow right past that. First of all, we had a lousy year, so there's no point in dwelling on that. But you know, this actually gives me the opportunity to say one thing about these annual numbers. We say them every year. When they're really high, we brag about them. When they're really low, you don't hear us quite so loud. It doesn't mean that the level of enforcement effort has changed. I mean, any of you who do cases know that these things take a little while, and there's stuff in the pipeline. Sometimes the pipeline disgorges huge, cases that are finalized, and sometimes they don't. So this is more of an artifact than anything else, the fact that FY09 has relatively lower numbers. This coming year looks better already. And these are Region 2 results, kind of the same thing. These are in your materials, so you can take a look at them. This is where I want to start. Because, Carter's question was, what is the guiding principle? And much of what I wanted to talk about today had to do with not so much the answer, to the extent that there is an answer, but the evolution of the process of, I think, getting to an answer. And I think there are indications right now, and maybe there are a little bit more than indications of where we are going. Because what is the seminal defining characteristic of this moment at EPA? It's a new administration. People have new ideas. People are thinking about things that we've been doing up until now and are trying to figure out, is this the right way? Can we do it better? Are there things we'd rather emphasize than perhaps have been emphasized in the past? And so while Judith did talk about Administrator Jackson's themes, I have them up again. You can see it. Yeah, I have them up again. I'm going to read through them, and then we're going to go on to the next set of themes or priorities or initiatives or whatever we call them as we go through it. Taking action on climate change, improving air quality, assuring the safety of chemicals, cleaning up our communities, note that word, protecting America's waters, as part of that discussion Jim was talking about, everybody was talking about waters, environmental justice, expand the conversation on environmentalism, and you're going to hear the word transparency a lot. So sort of link those two together, I think. Building strong state and tribal partnerships. Okay, that's coming from the administrator. Those are her basic themes. First day in office, she sent an email around to everybody, which had 5 of these, and then this got expanded to these 7 themes. So everything that we're doing fits into this framework. There's a lot here, but this is the basic framework. Okay, so now, the OECA, our enforcement group in headquarters, Cynthia Giles is the AA for that, the assistant administrator. She has come out with her own series of goals, okay? And there are basically 3. This is her framework. Community enforcement, there's that word again, right? Go after pollution problems that make a difference. State relationship, deliver on joint commitment to a clean and healthy environment. Transparency, there's that word again. Make compliance information more available, hold government more accountable. Now I'm going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. We're not going to be able to do them in exhaustive detail. There's a paper actually in the materials which does a little bit more detail than I'm going to do right now, so I refer you to that. Under what I'm calling the first goal, the community enforcement goal, OECA's enunciation of this, elaboration of it, 4 parts, clean water, and this actually refers to something else that I'll talk about in a moment, something called the Clean Water Act Action Plan, which is actually probably the most fleshed out of these things at this point. It exists as an actual plan, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Get raw sewage out of the water, cut pollution from animal waste, reduce polluted stormwater runoff, okay? So that's under that one. Clean air, what are we looking at there? Cut toxic air pollution in communities, okay? There's that word again. Reduce air pollution from largest sources, including coal-fired power plants, cement, acid, and glass sectors. Okay, that's clean air. Climate and clean energy. Assure compliance with greenhouse gas reporting rule. That's actually one of the things she's focused on. Encourage greenhouse gas emission reductions through settlements. Target energy sector compliance with air, water, and waste rules. And then the last one, protect people from exposure to hazardous chemicals. Prevent releases of hazardous chemicals that threaten public health or the environment. Press for cleanup of hazardous sites and communities. Polluter pays. Reform chemical management enforcement, reduce exposure to pesticides. Okay, I'm just going to continue. I'm going to go through this because what I want to try to do is build a framework, and so you can see what has been said already about these issues. Again, there's so much been said that maybe we're going to have to refine it a little further as we get more into the implementation. But this is the basic framework that's been set up. State relationship goal, that was number 2 in Cynthia Giles' list. 3 sub-goals again. Shared accountability, make joint progress with states and tribes toward clean air and water goals, protection from exposure to hazardous chemicals, work toward shared focus on protecting vulnerable communities. All right? Strengthened oversight is the second one. Assure strong, effective state enforcement, federal environmental laws, press for consistent enforcement across states and regions, fairness and level playing field. Now, this obviously exists against the backdrop of the economic realities that it's come up over and over again during the course of today's discussions. How do these fit together? I don't know. Put your finger on that idea. We'll come back to it, I guess, over and over again, I suspect, as we flesh these out over time. The third one, establish new model for shared accountability and strengthened oversight, and specifically, they wanted to start with water. So the idea there, build focus on highest priority problems into grants, enforcement, and permitting agreements. Grants, enforcement, and permitting agreements. We're getting outside of the enforcement realm alone now. We're starting to think about this a little bit more holistically, but enforcement is this is the part that we're focused on right now. Define clear expectations for state performance. Take federal action when not meeting minimum expectations. We're going to have to come back to that too. That's also come up. The question came up earlier. You know, are the feds prepared to step in and do enforcement? Well, sure. You know, as long as we have enough of us there to do everything that needs to be done, that's going to be an issue too, because resources are not infinite. But that's the basic idea. Transparency goal, and this is real. This is not just a rubric that you're going to hear. Transparency is real. 3 sub-goals. Make meaningful, have I been community? So I guess I need to advance this along so you can see these things as well. Transparency goal. All right, make meaningful facility compliance information available and accessible using 21st century technologies. That means e-filing. That means getting away from paper. That means using databases and things like that. Hold government accountable through public information on state, yes, but also federal performance. All right, this is not just about, hammering on the states. We're hammering on ourselves as well. And the third is promote better federal environmental decisions and public engagement through NEPA, which is an interesting sort of anomaly. As it happens, one of those organizational things, NEPA is in the enforcement group in headquarters, and so I think that's where that comes from. All right, now, that's one set of goals. That comes from Cynthia Giles and Awika. What have we been doing in the past? We are currently, actually right now, this year, in the third and last year of the current 3-year enforcement priority cycle. I'm doing this little quote thing because we don't longer call them priorities, we call them initiatives. And why did we make that change? The articulated reason for making that change is to expressly acknowledge the fact that, yes, they're priorities to us, but it doesn't mean that everything else is unimportant. We're trying to sort of get this nuance here, where, yes, this is an initiative we're going to be applying ourselves to, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other things that are important. It doesn't mean that there are other very important areas where we need to focus that perhaps are better suited to a different approach than this particular, this enforcement approach. And just to recap for the folks who may not be familiar with this, the current national enforcement priorities, now called initiatives, were air toxics, new source review, PSD, concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, municipal combined sewer and sanitary sewer overflows, stormwater, mineral processing, financial responsibility, and Indian country. The criteria that we used to select those were basically, I have to remember to do this, lawyers and technology. All right. Significant environmental benefit of our proceeding this way, a defined pattern of noncompliance. We were looking for that. Obviously, we don't want to be knocking on doors where people are in compliance with everything, and that these cases were appropriate for EPA to act on, large cases. We're talking about the fairly large and complicated ones. All right. Okay, these are the ones that I just talked about before. Now, we're already looking ahead to the next cycle. All right, these are the initiatives. The first cycle was done with a fairly robust, if you can use that word, outreach effort. We got input from states, from Indian nations, from community groups, from within the agency, all different areas within the agency. And for this next round, which begins in 2011, which is really the first place where this administration sort of puts its stamp on what it wants enforcement to look like. Similarly inclusive process, okay? A lot of input coming into all this. And you're going to find as I read through these that there's a lot that sounds pretty familiar. Keep raw sewage and contaminated stormwater out of the nation's waters. Okay? That's CSOs, and that's sort of the things that we were looking at before. Cut animal waste. That's CAFOs again. Reduce widespread air pollution from largest sources. Not dissimilar to what we have up until now. Cut toxic air pollution that affects communities' health. That's air tox. We're doing it now. But there is going to be a little bit of a nuance there that may change the way this looks for the next cycle. Assure energy extraction compliance with environmental laws. That's brand new. Figures, right? This is something that we're becoming a lot more attuned to. We're becoming far more conscious of the issues and far more aware of our need to grapple with them. And mineral processing, which is just a straight holdover from the last one. Okay. Before we get to this, I'm going to go back to this slide. The initiatives are still in the process of being fully fleshed out. These are the basic ones that we're going to be doing. We are if you recall from previous of these presentations that I've made, if you've attended them, the way we work this out nationwide is that each of the then priorities, now initiatives, is overseen by a strategy implementation team, which consists of various headquarters members and a regional member. I happen to be the regional member on air toxics. And we are in the process right now of taking this basic framework and turning them into actual strategies that could be implemented in 2011. So there's still more to be done. But I think this is interesting in that to the degree that Carter is asking what is the guiding principle, there are principles that are emerging from this, right? There is a focus on communities. There's a focus on problems, trying to, which is not unique to this period in time. We've always tried to put our efforts where they made the most sense. But there's a renewed desire to do that, to take another look and make sure that our resources and the resources of the states and everybody who's engaged in this effort are really being put where they'll make the most impact, where they'll do the most good. Have to do that. Otherwise, we're just wasting our time. So that is very much part of the process that we're going to be having going forward. Now, Clean Water Act Action Plan. This is an interesting one. You may recall a couple of months ago, there was a series of articles in the New York Times, which was not, shall we say, complimentary of the agency's efforts, or of those of the states, in enforcing the Clean Water Act. Okay, a whole series of articles. It touched on Region 2 facilities, but for the most part bypassed us and went on to focused on other areas of the country. But headquarters EPA heard this, very much so, and came up with this thing called the Clean Water Act Action Plan. It actually had a different title at the beginning. It was the Clean Water Act Enforcement Action Plan, then subsequently retitled Clean Water Act Action Plan. And it has 3 basic principles. Some of this is probably starting to sound pretty familiar. Target enforcement to the most important water pollution problems. Strengthen oversight of clean water enforcement performance by the states. Improve accountability and transparency. Now, this is something I very much recommend that you take a look at. I have a site to it in the materials, so take a look at it. You can get it on the internet. It actually goes into a fair amount of detail on all of these things. The targeted enforcement, for example, is going to be fleshed out in with joint work groups involving state folks with us as well. There's an effort to try to link data about environmental conditions with compliance. You know, we're really trying to figure out how we can take the various and to some degree disparate pieces of data that are out there. I mean, states have their own databases. We have our databases. There's all kinds of information out there. But the sense is that it's not being coherently linked. Certainly is not being linked in a way that optimizes our access to it and the usefulness of it. That's something we'd really like to change. So the effort is going to be to try to get that going a little bit better. Strengthen oversight. Very, very explicit acknowledgement that the states do the bulk of the enforcement inspections. They are, quote, the first line of environmental defense, close quote. That's right from the action plan. That's absolutely recognized. We've been doing oversight of the various state programs across the country. And, you know, not surprisingly, there have been places where some states are stronger and some places where the states could do a little bit better. So there's certainly going to be an effort to try to change that. Again, I will say, this is just me talking now, there's definitely going to be an effect of the context, the environmental context, the economic context that we find ourselves in. I mean, we can't find ourselves in a situation where we're saying do more, do more, do more, when we've got state governments that are grappling with economic almost catastrophes. I mean, very, very difficult economic times. So there's going to have to be an effort going forward to reconcile those kinds of things. And I think rather than spend a lot of time on that right now beyond what I've already done, I think I'm going to leave it at that for the moment. So this basically is what I've been able to glean from what I see coming out of our headquarters office and from the agency as a whole that might guide us a little bit in understanding what are the guiding principles. Now, once again, I have to caveat it because these problems are big. This is enforcement, right? Call a fireman, you get an axe or a hose. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There are probably an infinite number of variations on that theme. This is enforcement. It is not necessarily going to be the entire answer. This is the enforcement program trying to figure out what it can do to try to address some of these issues. All right, I'm going to spend the rest of my time going through a couple of things. Actually, it's 5 minutes left? 3 minutes left. All right, you know what? I'm going to stop it there because we're going to need some time for questions. So I'm going to stop there. What I've not done is my traditional overview of some selected case highlights. They are in the materials. They're in the PowerPoint. One of these days, one of these programs, it may occur that an enforcement update can be done without talking about the Hudson and the Passaic. Not today, not this program. There are developments in the Hudson. There are developments in the Passaic. What I tried to do with these case highlights is select not so much the biggest cases, but the ones that are kind of the most interesting. So what you're going to see in here, just a real quick overview of this, and as I say, I'll let you read it because at that point you'll be able to pick the ones that you're most interested in. There's a little bit about Tonawanda Coke, which you've heard about some more. We are working very closely with the state of New York to try to make sure that facility, the last remaining Coke facility in New York State, is in full compliance with all of the environmental laws, and we're working very closely and effectively, I think, with the state of New York to accomplish that. There's a very interesting write-up on which answers the question, the very burning question. I'm sure many of you have lost sleep over this, and that is, when is a computer not a pesticide? I recommend that you take a look at the Samsung Electronics case, which is written up there. They were making some claims, including, quote, antimicrobial keyboard, close quote, quote, the computer laptops use incredibly small nano-sized silver ion powder to coat the keyboard, making it virtually impossible for bacteria to live and breathe. Sounds like they're making some microbial claims, wouldn't you say? I think ultimately they ended up agreeing to the tune of over $200,000. I think it was $205,000. Some nice write-ups about some of the things that are important to us. We talked about Puerto Rico and its water issues. Pedro was here talking about some of that earlier. A very, very nice, very recent settlement. In fact, we're still in the public comment period of it for PRASA, where they will be addressing environmental issues at many of their drinking water plants. 126 of the drinking water treatment plants, they'll be addressing that over the coming years. It's almost a $200 million settlement. That, when coupled with a lot of other things that we've done in Puerto Rico, is going to make a difference. And we have some other cases written up there as well. I'm going to go to the very last one just because I can't resist it. Let me see if I can get there. 6 initiatives, the wrong way to go. Skip all that stuff. Caribbean. Okay, this is a kind of a cute one. We issued this 7003, Record 7003 order to the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, as it turned out. It was issued September 22nd, 2009, and it provides for the proper management of hazardous waste confiscated by, as it turns out, the Puerto Rico Police Department. So big deal. Why am I flagging this for you? Well, it was illegal pyrotechnic devices. What does that mean? Fireworks. What we had was approximately 150,000 pounds confiscated over 7 years and stored in tractor trailers. 7 years, Puerto Rico's climate, you work it out. This could have happened anywhere, but it happened to happen here. And you'll be happy to know that that was all shipped to a treatment, storage, and disposal facility in Louisiana, an authorized one. And for those of you who think we're absolute party poopers because we deprived the world of the amazing fireworks display that would have occurred as a result of those things, here's a little picture for you, just so you don't have to feel too deprived. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Our next speaker will be Michael Fisher, who is the Director of the Legal Counsel Division for the Office of Criminal Enforcement, Forensics, and Training at EPA.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the chance to talk to you about criminal enforcement at EPA. I'm the legal director at EPA's headquarters criminal enforcement office. I've been in that position for about 4 years now. I spent about 8 years before that as a field attorney in Region 3 doing criminal enforcement work. And most of those years also working as a special assistant U.S. attorney in a couple different federal districts, prosecuting cases and arguing a few appeals. Since criminal environmental law is such a boutique area, and I assume a lot of folks in the room don't have a tremendous amount of personal experience with it, I was just going to give you kind of an overview, quick overview of the program and of the legal issues, and then maybe talk about some Region 2 specific cases at the end if there's time. But just to kind of check my assumption, can I see by show of hands how many of you have worked on a criminal prosecution or an investigation, criminal investigation matter? All right, that's a bigger chunk than I thought. I'll go faster on the overview and get into more detail. Let me talk about EPA's. Yeah, I'm told either one. Left or right, up or down, it all is good. It's a boutique program within EPA, as well as being a boutique area of environmental law. EPA's got maybe 17,000 employees. OECA, I think, has around 3,400 FTE, so 20% of EPA's total workforce is doing enforcement, and about 300 of those people are dedicated to full-time environmental criminal enforcement work. The largest kind of category of person in that group of 300 are special agents. They're federal criminal investigators like an FBI agent or an ATF agent. And they have kind of across-the-board federal law enforcement authority, so they carry firearms and they execute search warrants and they can make arrests, etc. They're the investigative kind of prong of the program. They're supported by a group of lawyers in regional counsel's offices around the country. Eric's got one full-time criminal lawyer right now and is in the process of hiring a second one in the next month or two. I worked in Region 3, as I mentioned, and there are about 30 lawyers, give or take, around the country who do field work in support of the criminal program, and then about 15 lawyers at headquarters that I supervise that do a mix of case support work, but more policy work and kind of program management work. This group of people there's also a forensics group in our laboratory in Colorado. They do search warrant work for us. They do seizures of evidence. They do lab analysis and testify at trial about forensic issues. So you put those kind of three legs of the stool together within the agency, investigative, legal, and forensic. You've got this group of 300 people working cases. At any one time, we've got about 750 open investigations. And in each region of the country, CID has a special agent in charge. So here, Bill Lametti could not be with us today, or I'd introduce him to you, but he supervises about 12 agents here in EPA Region 2. And they've got offices here in town and in Syracuse and New Jersey. They are hiring a couple agents in San Juan shortly. The announcement just came out on my email while we were on the break, so that's good news. That's in motion. But you can see by the size of that workforce that this is a particular approach to a particular kind of law enforcement problem, right? Judith mentioned, the environmental cop is on the beat. And we hear that a lot. You heard that a lot when the administration changed a year ago, and there's real truth in it for reasons that are obvious to folks in the room, I think. But there's also a sense in which it's a little bit misleading maybe when we call ourselves the nation's environmental police force, which we do in kind of public affairs materials. I got on the subway this morning from down by the EPA regional office, and I rode up here, and I don't know, maybe I saw 40 New York police officers between here and there. Does anybody know how many police officers, sworn officers, the department has? New York's got about 8.25 million people, and in the New York Police Department are, yeah, those are all pretty much on target, 36,000 police officers in New York City. So, somebody gets their purse stolen, or somebody gets murdered, or somebody is a victim of an assault in New York, a police officer is going to show up and get to work on that matter. And hopefully there's enough of them on patrol that many crimes that would happen otherwise are prevented just by their presence. We can't operate on that model with EPA's criminal enforcement group. We've got to be smart about applying these limited resources in a way that first kind of hooks up with other law enforcement assets around the country. So at the federal level, we work with Defense Investigative Services when we're working on an environmental crime on a DOD facility, for example. We used to work a fair bit with the FBI pre-9/11, and then they disappeared from environmental criminal work, but we hope they will come back online here going forward. We work also with state and local criminal investigators. And in fact, the head of CID spent the first 10 years of her career as an environmental crimes investigator here in New York with the AG's office. So we try to do what my law enforcement colleagues, many of whom are former military folks, call force multiplying, to get beyond 300 people and expand that circle of law enforcement assets. But even still, we're never going to get to 35,000 law enforcement officers for a population of 8 million people. So we've got to select cases and try and achieve results in a way that creates deterrence. Let me talk a little bit about the docket. There's a pie chart for you. Shows you how our 750 cases, give or take, break down by statute. You can see the 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock purple part is water. From noon to 3, thereabouts, is air. And maybe 7 o'clock to 9:30 is RCRA, and then some other miscellaneous stuff. There's a general crimes slice of that pie because I mentioned our agents have across-the-board investigative authority, and so we pursue and we look for opportunities to include in our environmental criminal investigations kind of traditional Title 18 criminal offenses, conspiracy, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering. We do that both to increase the deterrent impact of our work, and we also do that because it helps communicate to courts and to juries that we are talking about real criminal conduct here and not some, quote, regulatory offense that somebody happened to make into a criminal offense by virtue of legislative action. A quick word or two about kind of the lifespan of our cases to give you a sense of how we wrestle the information that we receive on an annual basis into the docket and then into a stream of prosecutions ultimately carried out by DOJ. So here are last year's stats on that. front, you can see this kind of funnel from, maybe you can see it, from leads, this biggest category of matters that we run into. Last year, a little over 1,800. 8 out of 10 of those we take a look at and we send somewhere else, to EPA civil folks, to state agencies, to local regulators if they involve, solid waste issues, a pile of tires someplace. So about 20% of those turn into open investigations, and about a third of those investigations actually lead to criminal charges. In those cases where criminal charges are brought, we have a conviction rate of 92 to 95%, and like the other parts of the criminal justice system, most of our cases plead out. They like civil cases, settle rather than go to trial. So here's kind of the big picture program management or philosophical question that gets to kind of theme Eric was focused on. Why are we doing criminal enforcement work? To me, the biggest, the most generally applicable answer to that question relates to the basic organizing principle of American pollution control law, which is that it rests completely on an honor system. I've put a couple sub-bullets up there about things that make it difficult to find out about violations. I thought it went without saying, but I should include it on this slide, the basic fact that's much more exacerbated now because of the budget financial crisis issues we've been talking about all day, that there are never enough inspectors to look over the shoulder of a polluter, right? So we set up a regime, whether it's water, air, or waste, where they have to self-identify to the authority, and then they have to apply for a permit, and then they get a permit that has further monitoring obligations and self-reporting violations going on. And if they are violating the law, they need to be upfront about that with the civil inspectors, with the regulatory authorities. And when they are not, when they want to take advantage of the fact that, major Clean Water Act sources may or may not get inspected every year, or major Clean Air Act sources are complicated enough that when an inspection does occur, it may be pretty much a records review by an inspector instead of a multi-day facility, process-based facility inspection. When people want to take advantage of that fact and violate the honor system, then the foundation of our pollution control system starts to look pretty shaky. So we focus on that issue in our work and in our case selection. And the primary tool we're looking to apply to get leverage on that problem is the prison time that we attempt to impose in most of our cases. And is probably the single thing that makes us most different from a criminal enforcement action, right? We can prosecute a corporation criminally, and we do. But when we succeed in that, we issue a criminal fine to them. They face the public stigma of being declared a felon or a misdemeanant. But it's about money for a corporation, and maybe about conditions of probation and extra reporting requirements, et cetera. For individual defendants, they face potentially the loss of their liberty, and that's the biggest kind of deterrent lever we have to try to pursue the protection of health and human environment via deterrence. So that all those dynamics kind of are reflected in these stats, which are last year's numbers. Especially, it's rare we get our criminal defendants to line up perfectly with our number of agents, so that probably doesn't happen again. But these numbers are pretty representative of the last 3 or 4 years. And I just wanted to draw your attention, especially that second bullet. Of our 200 defendants last year, 3/4 of them were people, and 1/4 were organizations of one kind or another, mostly corporations. All right. A word about another kind of coping mechanism or strategy we use to achieve more with less, given resource constraints and the constraints that our investigative partners face at the state and local levels. One of the things that the new administration folks are trying to push into the career staff of the agency is a need to accelerate our transition into kind of 21st century information technology use. and that shows up in the kind of net DMR and other electronic reporting issues that you heard about from panelists earlier today. Here's one manifestation of it in the criminal program. About a year and a half ago, we put up a fugitive website, and it's an old idea, as old as the post office. I used to look at the FBI posters when I was a kid, and in the Old West movies, there's always a poster blowing in the wind on a wall someplace. But with the power of the internet and the ability to capture information and funnel it to the agency, we have seen real results. In the year and a half since we put up the website, about 6 of the folks who had absconded, either pre-trial or post-trial, pre-sentencing, or in one case, post-trial, post-sentencing, but pre-report date to the Bureau of Prisons, have been located and brought to justice, including the guy you can see in that photo, Larkin Baggett, who came out of a trailer in Florida last spring with an assault rifle and was shot by 2 of our agents and seriously wounded. He was in the hospital for quite a while, and last fall he pled guilty not only to the environmental offenses he'd originally been charged with, but to aggravated assault on federal officers, and received a 20-year prison sentence. And I raise Mr. Baggett's story not because it's representative of our cases, because it's not, thankfully. That's the only time an EPA law enforcement officer has shot anyone, and it may be the only time one of our folks has shot at anyone. But I do that just to give you a sense of the kind of breadth of the world that we deal with and the challenges that pose. I mean, a much more likely defendant is, a lab fraud case with scientists and managers and money people, or a big petrochemical or plant or refinery, and you're talking about, engineers and business people, oftentimes with graduate degrees, kind of classic white-collar crime. But there is a small segment of our world that deals with people like Mr. Baggett, who, I won't try to get inside his head and explain to you what he was thinking when he was dumping stuff into sanitary sewers in Utah and causing the local POTW to violate its permit, or instructing his employees to dump hazardous waste kind of on the back 40, or what he was thinking when he came out of his trailer with a rifle. But it's a challenge to find, hire, train, and deploy a group of officers, agents, who can deal with, both worlds. But they need to be able to do that. So that slide is just another view. If any of you are interested in the fugitive site, you can hop on the website and take a look. It gives you there on the left the current people who are running around in the world someplace and we're looking for, and the status of people who, thanks to tips resulting from this site, have been taken off the fugitive list. All right. 3 minutes left, maybe? Here we are in Region 2 discussion. I'll say just a couple things kind of programmatically and then with reference to individual cases. What I frequently tell people about the criminal program is that it's been undergoing a great degree of change in the last 3, 4, 5 years, as it is being run for the first time by people who have spent their whole career doing this type of law enforcement work. The program got started in the late 1980s, and as you might imagine, to kind of staff up an organization from scratch in a regulatory agency, you need to bring in people who know about cop stuff. And so they did that largely from other federal law enforcement agencies, FBI, DEA, the Secret Service. And it wasn't until 3 or 4 years ago that our program was run by somebody who was a career environmental protection, environmental enforcement official. I mentioned that our current CID director spent 10 years here in New York doing that work. She spent 20 years with EPA. As our program has matured and the program managers have come into their current positions, our ability to coordinate with the civil folks has increased exponentially. The former Secret Service agent who ran our program in the early 90s did a lot of good things, but he was never going to have a conversation about RCRA with anybody. And now there are people who have spent decades working RCRA cases and water cases and air cases, and it allows us to share information better, to have decisions about case selection and targeting that are much more productive, and to hopefully, deploy the limited resources we have in a way that maximizes the impact. So I'll talk just for a minute about kind of three types of cases here in Region 2. On appeal right now is a long-running case that was sentenced last year, the Atlantic States prosecution. It was one of 5 prosecutions of the McQuain Corporation, which is headquartered in Birmingham, over here in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. Ultimately, 4 corporate managers were convicted and sentenced to about not quite 15 years of prison between the 4 of them. The corporation was fined $8 million in a kind of an interesting twist. The court said that they needed to pay for a court-appointed monitor during their 4 years of probation. So somebody has been selected and will report to the district court twice a year about this felonious corporation's compliance with the law or lack thereof. There's a steady diet in Region 2, especially of asbestos-related criminal cases, and we will continue to work those, both because of the well-known qualities, toxic qualities of asbestos, and because of the environmental justice impacts those types of crimes have. And if you are New York Times readers, you've read about one of our most recent defendants who pled guilty about 3 weeks ago and is due to be sentenced in late June after falsifying hundreds of asbestos and lead inspections around the city. And then we have other cases open in many of the areas that you heard about today. We've got Marcellus Shale investigations open, and we've concluded 1 criminal prosecution in Region 3. We've got major Source Clean Air Act cases open, including Koch facility that several panelists have mentioned today. And we have wetlands cases underway here in the region, despite the considerable problems that Rapanos poses. And the slide from Judge Probst about not wanting to denigrate sausage makers was actually from one of our criminal prosecutions in Region 4, another McQuain case. So the overall kind of thrust of the program right now is to align with the rest of the agency, and in particular with the rest of the enforcement office, so that enforcement priorities generally, whether they're the national enforcement initiatives Eric mentioned, air toxics, NSR, PSD work, those are our initiatives within the criminal program as well, including the most recently adopted resource extraction initiative that obviously has Marcellus Shale implications here in the region and elsewhere in the country. So thanks very much, and we'll get to questions after Charles.
Good afternoon. First thing I want to do is to thank Eric Shaw for, he hounded me diligently the last several weeks to get me to come to this conference, and I really do appreciate it because, I hail from New York City, so it's great to come home, and it's great to spend some time with old friends like Michael Gerard and others. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is, being the very last speaker, I want to share with you is an opportunity to share with you a great story. And this is a story about a relatively distinguished speaker who ended up at a conference. And she happened to be, this conference went rather long. And by the time she was able to get up to make her presentation, only one person was left. So she got up and commended this person for sticking out to the end and profusely thanking him for at least being there when she spoke. And then he said, well, really, you're not the last speaker, I'm the last speaker. So with that, I hope everything is going downhill from there. So everyone knows Administrator Jackson's commitment to environmental justice, and I think the opportunity to make real progress towards her vision of integrating environmental justice in everything that EPA does is really remarkable. And for some of us, we say this is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She is the first African-American administrator of EPA. She was born and raised in the New Orleans Ninth Ward, and she brings a life story to EPA as the administrator that's a living embodiment of environmental justice. And so it's no surprise that she has said that she sees this as one of her legacies. Her first public appearance was at a climate justice conference in New York City. The New York Times wrote that a sister took the helm or takes the helm at EPA. In her first statement to EPA employees, she said that we must be sensitive to the burdens pollution has placed on vulnerable subpopulations. We must seek their full partnership in the greater aim of identifying and eliminating the sources of pollution in their neighborhoods, and we must connect with those who have been historically underrepresented in EPA decision making. Like all Americans, they deserve an EPA with an open mind, a big heart, and a willingness to learn. So these are her priorities, and you heard them already, and so I'm not going to go over them for the sake of time. The one on expanding the conversation on environmentalism and working for environmental justice is obviously the one I will focus on. But I will say that when we talk about environmental justice, the administrator is talking about it being a part and parcel of all the priorities. And for that reason, I want you to focus on the statement of mission for the Office of Environmental Justice, which is to facilitate the agency's efforts to protect environment and public health in vulnerable communities by integrating environmental justice in all programs, policies, and activities of the agency. What we're saying is that it is not about what the 17 employees in the Office of Environmental Justice and the 30 or so odd other employees dedicated to environmental justice at EPA is not what we do, is what the whole agency does, and our role is to facilitate them. And ultimately, we think that the true test of whether or not EPA has accomplished its environmental justice goals is whether or not it has made actual, real, concrete, tangible differences in the environment and public health of minority, low-income, tribal, other vulnerable communities. This slide here it talks about our statutory authorities and the executive order on environmental justice. And this is going to be a theme that's going to run throughout not only this presentation, but I think more and more conversation to come. I want to make as you know, President Clinton back in 1994 issued an executive order on environmental justice, and that has been very much a central part of the environmental justice dialogue. However, I think it is more important to say that EPA's ability, authorities to address environmental justice issues is not within the executive order. It is within our own statutory authorities. And this is something that the General Counsel back in 2000 had issued an opinion on, and is something that I think it is now time that we're able to really kind to apply that and bring that to fruition. Our program strategies are simple. We want to engage impacted communities in EPA decision making, apply our regulatory tools to protect vulnerable communities, to empower these communities to build healthy, sustainable, and green neighborhoods, and to build internal mechanisms for integration and accountability. So I want to just kind of give some examples. Expanding the conversation on environmentalism and engaging our communities and building our partnerships with others. 3 examples. We just completed for Earth Day a Faces of the Grassroots Environmental Justice video contest. So Mike talked before about us coming into the 21st century in terms of use of the media. And this is a great example. You can actually see the finalists on YouTube, and they include a video on pesticides and farm workers, on on lead poisoning in Worcester, Massachusetts, and my favorite one is one named "A Dream Reborn." My president is green, and so. The EPA Administrator Jackson is undertaking with the Congressional Black Caucus an environmental justice tour. 2 stops have been made, one in Mississippi in Congressman Benny Thompson's district, and in South Carolina in Jim Clyburn's district. One of the next ones, I'm not sure it is the very next one, is going to be in New York and New Jersey. And lastly, Maddie Stanislaus, who many of you know hails from New York City as well, is the Assistant Administrator for Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. And he's he's made community engagement a real hallmark of his leadership, and this is a community engagement initiative that that's pretty wide-ranging, and so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. Applying regulatory tools. EPA is on the verge of issuing guidance on incorporating environmental justice in the action development process or the rulemaking process. This is actually historic. I mean, I think in all the years I worked on environmental justice, which is many, we've always talked about this, but we never gotten to the point where guidance is actually going to be issued. And so look out for that. The second major plank of this agenda for regulatory development is making sure that we are working on a strong science base. The foundation for doing disproportionate impact analysis is something that a number of offices at EPA has been working on. We recently held a pretty major symposium on the science of disproportionate impact analysis in Washington, D.C. The papers from that are going to be published in about a year. It takes that long in the American Journal of Public Health. Opportunities to make use of environmental laws. The Office of General Counsel and Office of Environmental Justice and others have been working to build on that memo that I cited in 2000 to understand better what this means. And then lastly, in terms of transparency, there is EPA is now putting all its upcoming rules on something called a regulatory gateway. And within this, just from the parochial perspective of environmental justice, there's a flag for every rule that EPA has deemed to have significance for environmental justice. Building healthy, sustainable communities, I want to just give you 2 examples. The first one of this is that we are now undertaking a set of projects across the country called Environmental Justice Showcase Communities. The one for Region 2 is here in Staten Island. And I thought this is a good picture because it shows you in these communities the kind of cumulative impacts, the multiple stressors and cumulative impacts that exist. And this project here is meant to work with the community around doing community-based health research and developing strategy to address their concerns in areas like elevated blood levels and enforcement issues, abandoned properties, etc. The other ones across the country are located in Port Arthur, Texas, Milwaukee, Kansas City, Los Angeles, along the I-710 highway, and Yakima, Washington, which is a rural area where there's a lot of concentrated animal feeding operations. The DOT EPA. The DOT HUD EPA Partnership for Sustainable Communities is a really significant effort that brought the 3 agencies together, and it is seeking to make sure there's better transportation choices, equitable, affordable housing, supporting the kind of community that exist, leveraging investments, all to the point where there's better energy efficiency, housing, transportation. And I think one thing that we're really pleased by is when the partnership looked at what are some of the barriers to success, it noted the inability of communities to truly access the federal government's resources. And that is speaking to environmental justice. And then internal accountability mechanisms, we say in terms of strategic planning or planning and budget, that the true test of a organization's commitment to an issue is what kind of resources it devotes to it. And this is why this area is so important. EPA is developing its 2010 to 2015 strategic plan, and environmental justice is going to be a major part of it. Like we said before about integrating environmental justice, we think that it is going to be a challenge, but it is very important that environmental justice is captured in the measures for each of the strategic plan goals. And again, I think that the test, what we say about what environmental justice, one way to think about what environmental justice means is what kind of resources, attention is devoted to the communities that need it the most. And then lastly, I want to update you about the Inspector General back in 2006 asked that there be program evaluations around environmental justice, and we just completed a set of about 15 or so. The highlight, I think, from that is a number of them have begun to look at communities or areas, geographic areas where there are vulnerable populations, and the extent to which EPA's programs, like in air toxics, have been devoted to, have been addressing issues in those areas. So the next two slides are going to look at the administrator's priorities and some of the environmental justice highlights. You heard about climate change, the greenhouse gas endangerment funding. It is important to note that that it constantly refers to disproportionate affected communities, vulnerable populations, and environmental justice or themes such as that are constant throughout the endangerment finding. The next item is actually a misnomer. Is actually what I wanted to point out was the CEQ's Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, which is working hard to complete a report by towards the end of the year. Its interim report is now out, and two things that I think are important in terms of talking about, just not talking about adaptation, it also brings up the idea of resilience, and from an environmental justice perspective, resilience needs to also talk about social resilience in terms of a social community sense. And these are issues that have come up again and again in Katrina. One thing I want to share with you is that there's a book that's written about the 1995 Chicago heat wave, and I think over 500 people died there. And the lack of resilience in the community where most of those deaths took place is just, I think the author made a case that that's the single factor that was most important. He looked at that, the African American community, and a community that was right next to it, which was a community called Little Village, that have same characteristics, same demographics, but because of the kind of social networks that were there, only 3 fatalities took place. And so, so I think these are issues really important coming into the future. Now, recently there was a task force on oceans and coastal policy from CEQ. And this is all about climate adaptation as well. I think they finished their report recently, but they held hearings in Alaska, and in New Orleans. So I think that's another kind of important area of work, which is going to be kind of all joining up together. Improving air quality. This is a very interesting issue because in, I think, 2008, December 2008, the D.C. Circuit Court ruled that EPA's rule at that point around which exempted major sources from normal emission standards during startups, shutdowns, and malfunctions was inconsistent with Section 112 of the Clean Air Act. So EPA, the Office of Air and Radiation, is in the process of reissuing the rules. But the way that EPA is thinking about this is very interesting, because what we're starting to talk about in terms of environmental justice as just being one part of it, and this is really pertinent to the kind of communities where these refineries are located, is to look at rules and then permits and monitoring and enforcement together as something that are connected with each other. And I think that's really kind of one of these new ideas that Eric was talking about. TSCA reform, if you look at the EPA the principles had talked about vulnerable populations, engaging the communities in a very big way. Cleaning up communities, I think there's a policy that Maddie kind of put forth around how to think about brownfield redevelopment and community efforts. Not in terms of individual sites, but in terms of the whole community, that you're not doing this, ultimately our activities to clean up, assess and do cleanup has to be linked to revitalization, and that is done better if you're doing area-wide planning. So EPA has a number of pilots out in that direction, and this is directly linked to the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. Protecting water, the Urban Waters Initiative, I think this is really exciting. EPA is now designing a set of initiatives to take place in all 10 regions, which links our efforts to clean up urban waters with community efforts to revitalize and link and engage the communities, so that that becomes a springboard for real community revitalization. And then lastly, mountaintop mining, which I think has taken up a lot of the administrators' attention over the last several months. We came out with, now EPA has issued guidance to the regions around mountaintop mining that takes into consideration some of the new scientific findings, as well as, I would say, something, let me go back to that slide about statutory authorities. I think this is the first time that statutory authorities such as the Clean Water Act 404 authorities and 402 have been used as environmental justice hooks, as been statutory authority to address environmental justice issues. And that might be a little footnote, in history, but it is, I think, really important. So the administrator said that what she felt one of her big accomplishments in her first year was a turnaround EPA. And so we can now say that we are guided by a bold vision of public health protection and environmental preservation. And environmental justice is central to that vision. And we look forward to working with all of you to make real progress in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is a question for Mr. Lee. I really like the comment you made about community resilience. And one thing that we've been discussing recently is with respect to what's happening on the Gulf Coast, many of those coastal communities are particularly not resilient for a variety of reasons, and I'm wondering if the Office of Environmental Justice has been thinking about what the impacts, environmental justice impacts, are going to be of the spill in that region.
I think first of all, the amount of time that the administrator, the deputy administrator, and others like Maddie and Lisa Garcia have spent both in the region and working on the issue is pretty is, I think is really commendable. And they've gone out there and really, talk with the people there, with the communities. There are several interesting things here. After Katrina, one of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council made some recommendations about how EPA can address environmental justice in its disaster relief, and so one is to put an environmental justice function into the incident command system, and so therefore that is happening with the Gulf Coast bill. So that's one thing. I think the larger question of resilience, I think that's a bigger issue than EPA. I think, and it certainly is, but I think we can play a role in engaging, getting the communities engaged with the kind of all the right parties to talk about that. And what I'm happy, one of the things I'm really pleased by is within, the many people that look at disaster relief or disaster issues, this issue of community resilience is coming up more and more. So there will be an important, I think, part of the partnership with those communities to address these issues.
Yeah, Kevin.
Thanks, Alan. This is Mr. Fisher. I noticed in looking at your breakdown of criminal prosecutions, hazardous waste was 19%, water might have been 37%, and yet as I go through the circuit court rulings every year, the overwhelming amount of litigation seems to be hazardous waste. Does that reflect where the crimes are or where you're putting your resources?
When you say the litigation's hazardous waste, you mean criminal cases, or do you mean
civil?
I see. It's a good question. I think there is an extent to which, or at least I'll share with you the perspective of my boss, who started in the late 80s as a criminal investigator in Region 6, a lot of cases in Texas and Louisiana, and there were a lot of hazardous waste cases during that period. And when people think about an environmental crime, kind of the midnight drum dumper is, classic figure. People have, I think, started to do less of that than they used to, just because of the maturity of the regulatory regime and the more obvious kind of aspects of that type of crime, and I think that's another reason why the water slice of our pie is so big. Somebody dumps a big slug of material into a sanitary sewer and a treatment plant upsets, or somebody dumps something into a surface water and there's a fish kill. People know that, and people start tracing it back. Somebody dumps a bunch of drums or buries them, somebody will talk eventually, and those drums are going to get found. In the air context, somebody bypasses their flare or bypasses, another pollution control device, lets their bag house deteriorate. Maybe with the bag house you'll see, visible emissions and there'll be some kind of response. But air cases are much less amenable to detection, I think, which is one reason our slice has been, smaller than it should be over time. But I do think, just based on what I hear from, the old-timers, if you can be an old-timer in a program that's only 25 years old, that there's less of the classic drum dumping stuff than there used to be.
Does the reporting have an influence with the more intensive reporting, the hazardous waste for treatment, storage, transportation?
Well, I don't. It's a good question. You mean the manifest system? And the EPCRA reporting requirements for? It's a good question. Certainly, in the RCRA cases we do work, people have falsified those documents in order to cover up illegal activity. And so, there's a paper trail with regard to any environmental medium that's being regulated, right? And the government's ability to ground truth that paper is probably just as good in the RCRA context as it is in any other.
Okay. And back there.
How are environmental benefit projects for local communities in lieu of or in addition to monetary penalties being used either in the general area of enforcement or to assist with environmental justice issues? How has that evolved over the 20 or so years that these have been used?
I think this is probably something for Charles and I both to talk about. The whole area of supplemental environmental projects, which is I think what you mean by environmental benefit projects, is one that's always been in flux for us because it's an interesting kind of a creature in the enforcement context. It was kind of created What are we doing with these things? It had implications for tax laws. It had implications for all kinds of things. And there are some important limitations. You had to have the appropriate nexus to the kind of activity that was being suggested. The agency couldn't have certain relationships to it. We couldn't use it to supplement an appropriation, illegal augmentation. So there are all kinds of, aspects to this needle that has to be threaded. And there's a lot of discussion about that going on continuously, including now. Wherever we can find them, where we can find something that actually fits all of those things, and if it assists on the environmental justice side, it would be a perfectly appropriate. As long as it meets all those other criteria, we'd be very interested, and we do them wherever we can. Charles, did you want to add anything?
No, but I will say that one of the really notable ones was here in Region 2 in Puerto Rico.
Catania?
That's right.
Yeah, emergency vehicles. Which one are you thinking about?
The one with Rosa Hilda Ramos and the wetlands.
Yeah.
It was a EPA. I forget the name of the power plant, but there was a $7 million fine, and then there was a $3.4 million supplemental environmental project that was negotiated to help the Catania community recover wetlands.
Yeah, so we look for them where we can find them, and we still. I've always thought SEPs were cool. It's a little, it's just neat to be able to do some of this stuff if we can find ones that fit within that framework that we have to be able to put them within.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Question for Eric, and it has to do with municipalities and their efforts to comply with the Clean Water Act and also the effort to make more transparent the EPA enforcement efforts. Just two comments. One, as you know and as you mentioned, the capital costs for coming into compliance are ever increasing.
Yeah.
Obligations are increasing, as Jim Tierney suggested. Many municipalities find themselves on the wrong ends of enforcement cases by DEC and EPA. They're not capable fiscally of paying fines and penalties. That kind of money ordinarily should go into environmental or environmental projects, and yet the EPA policy requires some table penalty in addition to that. Are there discussions underway to evaluate how municipalities can avoid what are now, given the fiscal crisis, draconian penalties that feed into the tax base and taxpayer revenues, otherwise having to feed poor people or buy free lunches? And the second comment has to do with the expedited settlement process. Just in case I've been involved in recently, where EPA was involved in an enforcement matter under a stormwater case, and the usual notification in this case was put it on the EPA website. It doesn't really provide the kind of transparency and notice to affected municipalities. This would happen to be adjacent to a water supply, directly affecting the water supply. The municipality never got through that. So just areas that I think could use improvement.
Yeah. Now, you raised some very, very big issues in terms of the way the enforcement process fits within the overall context. And, obviously, these are discussions that are going to have to go forward. To some degree, they can have, in some cases, they can have an enforcement, solution. In some cases, the solution may have to go beyond that. And there is actually a recognition of that, although the precise discussion that you're talking about, I'm not sure is going on, certainly not within the agency. That's probably something that needs to go on a much wider basis. That's the legislature. Okay. But there certainly is a recognition that there are certain kinds of problems that are more or less amenable to, say, the initiative approach. And in the materials that were associated with that on the website, I think the specific example that was given were the small community water supplies, where you've got, one of the places where we've wrestled with that is Puerto Rico. And we have, a lot of supplies that are, a lot of folks who are tied into the process system, but there are a lot of people, we call them the non-process. There are hundreds of them. Sort of in the mountains of Puerto Rico, in the interior parts of Puerto Rico, they're very small towns, very small facilities. Most of them are out of compliance. And what do you do there to try to get them into compliance? You sue somebody? These are people who are trying to keep this water supply going for themselves. And it's a very, very difficult problem to get a handle on. And I think the recognition is that there, pure enforcement probably isn't the right answer. Maybe enforcement has a role, but there's also got to be some funding mechanisms, some training, some guidance, all kinds of things that you might be able to think about, education efforts. Try to get people to tie into the process supply wherever we can. because in some cases, folks have kind of gotten used to the idea that they don't have to pay the process fees, and they sort of, that need to pay the fees makes the water taste funny, you know? So it's one of those kinds of things. So there's an educational aspect to this as well. It's a very complex problem.
Okay, thank you very much to our panel. I want to thank our sponsors, the ABA section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, the State Bar Environmental Law section, the New Jersey State Bar Association Environmental Law section, the City Bar Association Committee on Environmental Law, of course, EPA Region 2, and especially Columbia Law School and Mike Girard and his staff and their Center for Climate Change Law.